Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. You're not in a palace. You're not a priestess. You're not even close to the Nile. You are a pregnant woman in Deir el-Medina, a laborer's village tucked into the desert cliffs near ancient Thebes, built to house the workers who carved tombs for pharaohs. It is hot. Hey, it is dry, and there is very little shade, but your belly is full, heavy with a child you didn't ask the gods for. Not really. You're in the middle of your 7th month, and you've run out of excuses to stay home from the communal work of the village. You're still grinding barley, still hauling water from cisterns baked in the sun, and still navigating the delicate dance of staying quiet in a home made of mud brick walls that seem to amplify every cough, every sigh, every argument from the room next door, and no one's bringing you fruit or massaging your swollen feet. Because in Deir el-Medina, being pregnant didn't make you special. It just made you more expendable. A town built on labor, not luxury. Deir el-Medina wasn't like the grand cities near the river. This place had a purpose. It existed because pharaohs wanted beautiful tombs. And beautiful tombs needed skilled labor stonemasons, painters, scribes. So the state built a village to house them and their families, tucked away so the workers wouldn't be distracted or escape with secrets. The men were paid in food rations, barley, beer, fish. They worked 8-day weeks, followed by 2 days off. The women stayed behind, running households, raising children, preparing food, managing survival. And when a woman became pregnant, it was not a moment for celebration. It was a countdown clock, another mouth to feed, another body to lose in. Infancy, another year of grinding through life while your own body turned against you. Pregnancy wasn't sacred. It was expected. The silent burden there were no pregnancy pillows, no checkups, no iron supplements. What you had was this, the rhythmic kick of a child growing inside you, and the constant whisper of fear underneath it. You feared miscarriage. You feared stillbirth. You feared what would happen if the child was born healthy, but then fell ill from spoiled milk, bad air, or a bad omen. Women in Deir el-Medina didn't speak openly of these things. They shared glances. They offered barley gruel with a touch of honey. They looked for signs in the sky. But they did not say aloud what everyone knew. Most babies would not make it. And even if they did, the mother might not. You could bleed too long, tear too deep, get infected in the night, and never rise again. Birthing beds with a floor for linen draped couches or medical chambers. If you were giving birth in Deir el-Medina, you likely did it on a tightly packed mat of straw or directly on the beaten earth. Midwives, if they were even present, weren't called doctors. They were usually elder women from the village. Often widows were those who had borne multiple children. They had no formal titles, but they had knowledge, and they had nerves of stone, because they had seen it all. They knew which herbs could slow the bleeding, which ones might help the pain if any, and which words to whisper during the worst moments when a scream turned to a rasp or a mother's fingers turned cold. These were the mud brick midwives. They didn't wear robes. They didn't chant in temples. They just showed up when it mattered most. Pain was not a privilege. Ancient Egypt, pain was never treated as something to avoid. It was simply a fact. And for pregnant women, it was a requirement. Your back hurt. That meant the baby was growing. Your ribs ached. That meant the gods were watching. Your sleep was broken. Good, because you needed to prepare 4 nights without rest. And if you complained too loudly, too often, there were always other wives, other sisters, Other young women ready to prove they could do it with fewer tears. So you gritted your teeth. You kept moving. You kept silent. Because anything else made you appear weak, and weakness in the village, built to serve Pharaoh's tomb, was not tolerated for long. Superstition in every step by your 7th month. You've probably turned to the few rituals available. One involved urine tests, using barley and emmer wheat. You urinate on the grains and wait to see if they sprout. If they do, the theory goes, your pregnant hen, the type of grain that sprouts, might even predict the sex of the child. Another test was stranger still. A clove of garlic would be placed deep inside the vagina overnight. The woman could taste garlic on her breath in the morning. Her reproductive system was considered open and healthy. If not, it meant blockage and possibly danger. These were real tests, documented, not because they worked, because they were all anyone had. You also tied amulets of the hippo goddess Taurate around your neck, sometimes carved from faience, sometimes crudely molded from clay. She stood on 2 legs, heavily pregnant, bearing fangs. She was terrifying, but she protected mothers. You also honored Hathor, goddess of love and fertility. You scratched her name into a wall if you could, but when it came to actual labor, even goddesses kept their distance. The brick of birth, eventually, you would be brought to the birth bricks. These weren't figurative, they were literally bricks, to place beneath your feet and sometimes to under your back or hips. You would crouch or squat, gripping a cloth, often tied to the ceiling, to let gravity help with the birth. This position wasn't for comfort, it was for efficiency. Lying flat was rare. Squatting was faster, cleaner, easier to manage in tight quarters. Some midwives placed reeds beneath you to carry away fluids. Others laid down linen cloths if your household could afford them. You grunted. You breathed. You clenched the cloth in your hands, and you prayed not for the gods to notice you, but for the midwife. Stay calm, because if she stayed calm, you might live. And if you lived, maybe the child would too. No birth certificates, no celebrations. If the baby came and cried, that was the celebration. You might not name the child for several days. You might not hold them yourself right away, because no one was ready to hope just yet. They had seen too many small, pale forms buried in the sand behind the village. So you waited, you listened, you watched for breath, and only after a full day or 2 would you allow yourself the smallest smile. Even then, you didn't tell your neighbors. They would know soon enough when they heard the baby crying. And if they didn't hear it again after that, they wouldn't ask questions. That was dear El Medina. That was pregnancy in the desert. But how did the women recover? How were they treated in the days after? Did the midwives stay, or did the weight of motherhood shift instantly onto a new set of shoulders? There is no hospital, no convalescent room, no hushed corridor where others walk softly while the mother rests. There is only the heat, the thudding of stone tools in the distance, the sounds of everyday life returning too quickly, as if nothing momentous has happened. You've given birth in a narrow mud brick house with no windows, a hole in the roof for smoke, and walls that echo. If you're lucky, the baby lives. If you're luckier, you can sit upright without bleeding again. But now comes the harder part, recovering in a society that never paused for you. Recovery on a timeline in Deir el-Medina. Postpartum rest wasn't a right, was a race against survival. There was no measured recovery time, no healing sabbatical. The longer a woman was unable to contribute, grinding barley, cooking porridge, fetching water, the more strain she placed on others in the household. Some families had 3 or more generations under one roof, but space was limited. A woman might rest on a woven mat for a few days after childbirth, but by the end of the week, the expectation was clear. She should be standing, and if not, it wasn't judgment she faced. It was indifference, because daily life in this desert village didn't stop for blood loss. It didn't stop for infections, and it certainly didn't stop for maternal exhaustion. The midwife fades back into the dust, the woman who helped deliver. Your baby perhaps, your aunt, your neighbor, or an older widow who had assisted in dozens of births, did not stay long. She had no bag of medicine to unpack, no follow-up appointment, no chart to write on. Her tools were her hands and her memory. She might wash the cloths in a nearby basin, rinse her arms, and then disappear into the narrow passageways between. Homes already being called to someone else's hearth to help grind lentils. Midwives in Deir el Medina were unpaid. They offered their knowledge as part of the unspoken economy of women. You help me this time, I help you next time. But there were limits. A midwife would not stay overnight unless she feared the mother was dying. She would not offer spiritual guidance unless asked. Her role was mechanical, necessary, and temporary. After that, you were on your own. The unseen risks of the first 10 days modern medicine calls them the critical postpartum window, the first 10 days after birth. The time when most infections take root, when fevers creep in, and when slow internal bleeding silently takes a mother's life. But in ancient Egypt, these dangers had no names. They were understood only through observation and warning. If a woman died a few days after birth, they said, her body was weak. The gods reclaimed her. The child was cursed. There were no antiseptics, no antibiotics. Even washing linens was risky. Some homes had no fresh water close by, and blood-soaked cloths were often hung to dry in the same courtyards where cooking and washing took place. A woman might begin to sweat at night, feel dizzy by sunrise, speak in confused sentences by the third day, and then stop speaking altogether. There are burial records from Deir el Medina that hint at clusters of female deaths within days of a birth. But no written cause is listed. No one kept maternal mortality logs, but the silences are telling. The empty space where a woman's name was once etched into a wall. The sudden appearance of another wife in a household one season later. This was grief, but it was also routine. The birth amulets stay uneven after the birth. Many women kept their amulets tied around their necks or waists for weeks, sometimes months. Taurate, Goddess, the hippo goddess of childbirth, was not simply a protector of the birth process, but of postpartum danger as well. Her snarling face reminded mothers that they still stood close to the boundary between life and death. The household altar might hold a fresh offering, a smear of honey, a drop of beer, a tiny clay figure shaped like a breast or an eye. Women whispered prayers while nursing. Some marked small black dots on their baby's toes to confuse evil spirits. Others drew the eye of Horus on scraps of linen and tucked them under the infant's blanket, because in a village where diseases had no names and death had no schedule, magic was the only consistent medicine. Feeding the baby and everyone else, she, a newborn, nursed often. But this was no excuse to neglect the rest of the family. Within days, new mother was expected to be cooking porridge for the other children, sweeping the narrow floor of her home, and ensuring that her husband's linen tunic was mended for his next rotation in the Valley of the Kings. Breastfeeding itself was both a necessity and a trap. It was praised as the most sacred maternal duty, yet it also tied the mother down. There were no bottles, no formula. The mother could not nurse, and there was no wet nurse available. The baby would likely not survive. Some women turned to cow's milk, diluted and mixed with honey, but this spoiled quickly and often led to sickness. Others shared wet nursing duties with neighbors. In Deir el Medina, where the community was tightly knit, an infant might rotate between breasts if more than one woman had recently given birth. This created an odd bond. Infants who suckled from the same woman were sometimes referred to as milk siblings. They could not marry. Thou fates became interwoven in ways deeper than blood. But these systems only worked when luck was on your side. And in ancient Egypt, Luck was fickle. The baby survives. Now what? The baby made it past the first 2 weeks. It was likely to live to at least age 5. This sounds grim, but it was a statistical truth. Infant mortality was high, but so was the survival rate after the fragile early weeks. Still, for the mother, survival didn't mean rest. A surviving baby meant uninterrupted exhaustion. There were no diapers, no pacifiers, no rocking chairs. Babies were swaddled in cloths, strapped to backs with coarse linen, or laid in shallow baskets lined with straw. They cried often. They sweated in the heat. They attracted flies, and yet the mother had to work. She had to keep the house. She had to continue being a wife. You were still expected to conceive. Again, perhaps the most draining reality of all was this: one birth was never enough. A woman's worth in Deir el-Medina was tied to her fertility. Having one child was admirable. 2 was expected. 3 or more. Ideal. There was little understanding of long-term birth control. Withdrawal and periods of extended breastfeeding were the only practical spacing methods available. But the pressure remained, especially if the child was a girl, especially if the firstborn didn't survive. Husbands, while not openly coercive by our modern standards, made their expectations clear through daily ritual and community assumption. There are papyri where men wrote about their wives in cold, transactional terms. She bore 2 sons. She is pleasing. She failed to conceive again. Another wife has come. So even as the last birth scar healed, the mother braced for the next round of expectation, effort, and danger. The midwife's return was not promised. Midwives were not always available. If a woman labored during festival days or during the sacred resting days, when workers were not allowed to enter the Valley of the Kings, she might give birth, alone or with the help of a younger daughter. Women in Deir el-Medina learned quickly. Do not expect help twice. This was not cruelty. It was survival, and it forced mothers to become midwives for others. Knowledge passed quietly through actions, glances, and whispered warnings during market days. Boil the water first. Place the bricks wider next time. Don't let her sleep too soon after the bleeding. Instructions like these, simple, stark, held the line between life and death. But what was the alternative? Could a pregnant woman in Deir el-Medina have chosen another life? Could she have avoided it altogether? Marriage was not rigid in ancient Egypt. Women had more autonomy than many of their counterparts in other ancient civilizations. They could own property, initiate divorce, and even refuse suitors. But pregnancy was not always a choice. Marital expectations, cultural pressure, the absence of medical contraception. All these things lead women toward birth again and again, regardless of whether they wanted to go there. Even the wealthier women, the wives of overseers or scribes, shared this burden. It wasn't class. It wasn't status. It was the structure of life itself. So what happened when the cycle continued? What if a woman bore child after child, and the fatigue of so many years left her fragile, thin, and aching? How long could she endure? How did she hide her exhaustion when others were watching? You have given birth. You have bled. You have fed the child from your body. You've returned to daily chores as though nothing extraordinary occurred. And now there is another wave. A new child grows in your belly. The line between survival and collapse becomes thinner, not because you were weaker, but because the expectations never left space for anything else. This is the 3rd child, or the 4th. You have lost track. There is no ceremony for surviving childbirth in ancient Egypt. No title. No honorific. No recognition for a woman who gives birth 5, 6, or 7 times and still wakes before sunrise to grind barley for the house. Even the gods are quiet this time. The weight of 2. Many births, the body remembers. The ligaments ache earlier in the day. The swelling begins sooner. The fatigue doesn't lift, even with rest. But you do not complain, because complaining is a luxury. There is no word in ancient Egyptian that cleanly translates to burnout. No formal language for the slow unraveling of strength through overuse. Yet, if you look closely at the records, stare in the gaps, the temple lists that stopped naming a woman after 3 years of marriage, the offering bowls left empty in family shrines, it's a sudden addition of a new wife in household tax records. Sometimes the silence is louder than words. The home was never just yours. George dear El Medina's homes were narrow and tall. The floors packed, hard with dust, the windows no larger than a brick. Privacy was rare. If your mother-in-law lived with you, you yielded to her. If your sister's child needed food, your own ration stretched thinner. If a neighbor came asking for water, you gave even when your bowl was near empty. Your body, too, was never just yours. It carried a new life hand with it, the responsibility to survive not just for yourself, but for the laboring village around you. You were a link in a chain that extended backward through generations of women and forward into the hopes of the community. You were exhausted. Name that might never be spoken still. There was risk. A mother might die before naming her child. An infant might die before anyone memorized its features. In cases like these, names might be withheld altogether. There are archaeologists who have unearthed burial plots from the New Kingdom period where infants were placed and reused. Pottery jars and buried beneath thresholds or inside walls. These jars are often unlabeled, silent. Some think this was an act of shame, but more likely it was practicality. Resources were limited. Grief was constant. Naming every lost child may have meant remembering too much. In dear El Medina, names were power. Names gave permanence, and sometimes silence was the only form of mercy left. The ritual of the reeds bud. Sometimes the child lived, and the mother did, to God. And when this happened, a different kind of ritual took place. In one corner of the village, near the edges of the cultivated earth, women gathered reeds. They would braid them together, forming narrow mats or binding sticks into protective charms. These were not religious icons, not officially, but they carried weight. Some say the reeds were left by the door of a new mother's home. Others say they were tucked into the eaves of the roof to keep away death. In either case, these quiet acts of care formed the hidden backbone of maternal life in the village. There are no papyri describing this ritual, no carved stele, no formal prayers. Just reeds, tied and placed with intention, and left to guard against the next misfortune. The village kept moving outside. The world never paused. Men continued their work, carving the tombs of pharaohs deep into the limestone valleys. Children played in the dust, shouting with the echoes of generations. The overseers counted rations, assigned tasks, kept track of copper chisels and red ochre pigments, and in the quiet shade of the homes, women kept giving birth. There are administrative records referred to as the Journal of the Necropolis that list absences among the workers. Some are marked ill, others mourning. A few simply say, "Wife is sick." No elaboration. These entries are likely the only written evidence that a woman in the household was struggling after childbirth. One sentence. Then the stonecutters returned to their work. What did it mean to survive? To live through childbirth. Once was luck, twice fortune, 4 or 5 times. That was endurance. But survival came at a cost. Bones weakened by calcium loss. Teeth rotted by malnutrition. Joints worn from crouching, lifting, carrying children while sweeping, while baking, while hauling water up the narrow steps. Women rarely lived into old age in dear El Medina. Those who did were revered not as saints or sages, but as proof that the body could carry the weight of motherhood and still stand. They became the midwives, the healers, quiet watchers of the new generation's pain. They had no temple of their own, no statues, no walls carved with their names, but the younger women watched them closely, listened when they murmured advice, trusted them when their bellies began to swell. This was how knowledge survived. Not in books, but in backs bent by years, hid, fingers rough from stone grinding herbs, in glances that said, "You are not alone." Gods who heard only half the story tour where the hippo goddess was often shown with one hand resting on her belly, the other raised in defense. She was a protector, but also a reminder that childbirth needed defending. Beside her stood Base, the dwarf god, tongue out, shaking a rattle to scare away the unseen demons. Their figurines sat on dusty shelves in homes with no doors. Their painted images stared back from linen canopies placed over newborns, and yet no god promised safety. Only attention Hathor, the great mother goddess, offered beauty in music, and was sometimes invoked during labor, where she did not visit every home. Only the wealthier ones had images of her sculpted on their walls. The gods, like the midwives, came and went. They hovered near, but they did not stay. A life written in clay and blood. When archaeologists today study Deir el Medina, Kaya, they learn most from garbage pits, shards of pottery, discarded tools, fragments of sandals, leftover bread. All tell the story of life as it was lived, not as it was recorded. And in that refuse are remnants of women's labor. A broken feeding cup, a discarded spindle, a scrap of linen too small to mend, a child's toy shaped like a crocodile. These items matter more than temple inscriptions, more than royal tombs, because they reveal the quiet truth. History is carried by the women who never had the time to write it down. So why did they keep going? Why bear child after child, knowing the risk? Why endure the pain, the exhaustion, the near invisibility? There's no single answer. For some, it was faith and offering to the gods through flesh and endurance. For others, it was family pride, the hope of a name carried forward. And for many, it was simply the shape of life. No one questioned the river for flowing. No one questioned the sun for rising. And no one questioned the woman for giving birth again. That's just what the world demanded. And so, they gave. What do we remember? Not their names, not their prayers, not their private moments of terror and strength, but we remember the outlines, the patterns, the rhythm of their labor and silence. They stood in homes without windows, carried children on backs while kneading dough, whispered old remedies while braiding reeds, and gave birth while the village went unchipping at tombs nearby. And when they died, our place was quietly filled. Until now. Now, we remember them in this dusty memory of a hot village under a wide sky. In the knowledge that survival is sometimes the most radical legacy of all. Let's imagine you're sitting on a sun-warmed step, tucked inside the quiet shadows of an ancient Egyptian courtyard. The air smells of crushed herbs and dry rushes. Somewhere nearby, a child is crying, and you pretend not to hear. Your thoughts are elsewhere. You are wondering if you are pregnant. But this is not the modern world. There are no plastic test sticks, no waiting rooms, no doctors. What you have, instead, is barley, an emmer, wheat, a bit of linen, a jar of your own urine, and a waiting game that's as strange as it is old. Because in ancient Egypt, discovering whether or not you were expecting a child often began with a simple question: will the grain sprout? Ancient fertility ritual hidden in plain sight. Wheat and barley test wasn't just folklore, it's one of the oldest known pregnancy tests on record. It appears on a papyrus dated to around 1350 BCE, sometimes called the Berlin Papyrus, although the knowledge itself may be even older. It's passed by midwives and herbalists through oral tradition. The test was straightforward but slow. A woman who suspected she was pregnant would urinate on 2 cloth-wrapped bundles of grains, 1 barley, 1 emmer wheat, and leave them in the sun for several days. If either began to sprout, it was believed she was indeed with child. If neither germinated, she likely wasn't pregnant. And here's where it gets oddly specific. If the barley sprouted first, suggested the child would be male. If the emar sprouted first, the child would be female. The method might seem laughable now, but modern science has studied it and, in limited testing, the grains did show slightly higher germination rates when exposed to urine from pregnant women, possibly due to hormonal presence in the urine. Not accurate enough to rely on, of course, but still remarkably intuitive for a society that lacked microscopes. Still, it took days to get a result. And in those days, there was nothing to do but wait and wonder. The silence between questions. What if the grains didn't sprout? What if they did, but the emar came up first, and your husband wanted a boy? What if you got no result at all? There were no printed instructions, no control lines, no nurse to call. In a world with dozens of gods, but few certainties, answers came slowly and sometimes never. So women turned to other options, other signs, other substances. The kitchen became a testing ground. The garden became a pharmacy. And the body became a puzzle. The pharmacy of the earth Egyptian medicine was a blend of observation, experimentation, and religious invocation. And nowhere was this more obvious than in the treatment, plant, and detection of pregnancy. There were dozens of recipes for fertility enhancement, pregnancy confirmation, and fetal protection recorded on medical papyri like the Ebers papyrus and Kahun gynecological papyrus. They included honey, used to lubricate the womb or ease passage during delivery, ground dates and beer yeast mixed into pastes to be consumed or applied, crocodile dung, yes, you heard that right, applied intravaginally as a contraceptive, onion juice inserted into the vagina. The scent reached the woman's mouth. By morning, her womb was considered open and, thus, fertile. You might be tempted to laugh or cringe, but these weren't crude guesses, okay? They were based on repeated practices linked to outcomes, passed along because they sometimes seemed to work. There was logic of a kind behind the madness. Crocodile dung, for example, when dried and shaped into a pessary, might have provided a physical barrier, not unlike a very primitive diaphragm. It was certainly unpleasant, but then again, contraception often was. But what about detecting a pregnancy after it began? Here's where the strange truly begins. The breath and the belly ancient midwives were skilled observers. They paid attention. Two subtle shifts, the way a woman's walk changed, the color of her gums, the taste in her mouth. They listened to the breath, checked for the thickening pulse in the thighs, noted morning nausea or the way the breasts responded to touch. And when those signs weren't enough, they used smell or spit or even pigeons. One test described on a now lost papyrus, referenced by later Greek writers, involved placing garlic or onion inside a woman's vagina overnight. If she could smell it on her breath in the morning, it was said her womb was open, a sign of fertility. Why? The theory was that the female reproductive system was directly connected to the mouth through some kind of bodily conduit. This belief, though biologically inaccurate, persisted in multiple cultures. And, since garlic molecules can travel through the bloodstream and be exhaled, sometimes did seem to work, even if for the wrong reasons. Then there was the pigeon test. In one case, a soft linen cloth was dipped in the woman's urine and then placed beneath the bird. If the bird reacted by avoiding the cloth or showing distress, was said the woman was pregnant. The science is thin. The method, dubious. But again, it was the only data they had. And when you have no better tools, the absurd can feel reasonable. The emotional toll of not knowing. Imagine waking up every morning unsure. No Miss Period chart, no tracking app. It's just a belly that might feel different. It's just a gut feeling that may be nothing. Pregnancy in the early stages is often invisible. And in ancient Egypt, invisibility meant risk. A woman didn't always want to be known as pregnant too early. If the child didn't take, she might be blamed. If it did, and she miscarried, people might say the gods were angry. If the baby was born female and the father was hoping for a son, her position in the household could weaken. Secrecy was a form of survival, which makes the desire to know even more haunting. The woman wanted to be certain, but not too certain. Wanted science, but not too public. Wanted safety, but knew it could not be guaranteed. And so she turned again to the barley test, or waited for her next period, or consulted the village midwife who had seen hundreds of cases and carried knowledge too subtle to write down. She waited and waited, attended. She wasn't waiting. The marketplace of promises at the edge of a town, perhaps in Thebes, taps in a village like Abuser, Elmac. There were market stalls where women sold more than dates and onions. There were dried herbs, powdered minerals, bundles of rolled papyrus with spells written in faded ink. Not all of them were sold by trained physicians. Some were offered by old women who spoke in whispers and claimed ancestral secrets. Drink this after intercourse. Burn this and walk through the smoke. Place this under your bed with the hair of a cow. They weren't selling knowledge. They were selling hope, because when pregnancy could mean death or status or security or the end of your usefulness, hope was currency. And hope in ancient Egypt was often shaped like a root or a stone or a prayer. The next signing then came the moment that silenced the wandering, the swell, the sickness, the mist, bleeding, the change in appetite. A quiet certainty settled over her, sometimes relief, sometimes dread, because now the waiting had shifted. Now she knew she was pregnant, but the question had only changed form. Not am I pregnant, but will the child live? Will I survive? Will it be a boy? Will my husband still want me after this one? One test ended, another began. Now that the answer was clear, now that the mist bleeding had confirmed what the barley test had only hinted at, the next chapter of life began. But calling it a chapter may be too tidy, too calm. It was, more truthfully, a storm of small agonies, quiet hopes, and daily inconveniences. And for many women in ancient Egypt, it was more punishment than miracle. There was no softness to pregnancy in the Nile Valley if you were not wealthy. And even for those born into elite households, there was no certainty of safety. Pregnancy was a gamble in a land of gods where the body became the battlefield, and the stakes were life and death. You, the pregnant woman, knew this already. You were taught it long before you conceived. You had seen it in the whisper of your aunt's absence, in the way one of your older sisters never bore a child again, in the quiet offerings at the shrine of Toret, goddess with the swollen belly of a hippopotamus and the teeth of a lioness. She protected the pregnant, but she did not promise outcomes. The tension between magic and medicine at the heart of ancient Egyptian pregnancy was a duality, half practical, half spiritual. Women were expected to manage their pregnancies with a combination of household remedies, community advice, and ritual protection. This wasn't superstition in the modern sense. It was survival, wrapped in mythology. The gods were not abstract concepts. They were physical presences in your life. Toret stood beside your bed. Base, the dwarf god, crouched at your feet, his ugly grin fending off evil spirits. Did not just believe in them. You counted on them, but belief alone was not enough. The Ebers Papyrus, an extraordinary medical scroll from the 16th century BCE, contains dozens of references to pregnancy treatments. It lists potions meant to cool the womb and reduce miscarriage. Others were designed to open the canals or tighten the vessel. Vague phrases that likely referred to the dilation of the cervix or the integrity of the uterus. Many of these concoctions were bitter and thick. They used herbs like frankincense and fenugreek, keys. Sometimes they were made into pastes and inserted like suppositories. Other times, they were crushed into powder and taken with wine, and sometimes they were merely ash, the burned remains of animals or insects mixed with honey or beer and offered to the body like a bribe. There was no regulation, no dosage guidelines, only trust in the recipe, in the woman who gave it to you. Hunger in the womb pregnancy made everything heavier, not just the belly, but the expectations. If the mother to be was from a peasant household, her pregnancy didn't excuse her from labor. She fetched water with jars balanced on her shoulder. She swept the courtyard. She ground barley by hand. She cooked. She stood in market queues. She knelt to the floor to scrub papyrus mats. Nausea came, but so did hunger. And the food available was not indulgent. Bread, sometimes flavored with herbs or fat, was the staple. On good days, you had lentils or onions. If the household was lucky, a little dried fish, but meat was rare. Eggs were rarer. There were no prenatal vitamins, a tone understanding of folic acid, no calcium supplements to guard against brittle teeth. The baby fed off your body, and so your bones thinned, your gums bled, your joints ached. Cravings were understood as signs. Wanting dates might mean you were carrying a boy. Desire for sweet beer could mean a girl. These were stories passed down through generations, not because they were accurate, but because they gave form to uncertainty still. The real cravings, the ones that came with desperation, were for rest, for quiet, for relief, and those rarely came. Protection through amulets. You didn't leave your home without them. Carved hippos, little clay crocodiles, beads of turquoise and red jasper shaped like the eye of Horus. Each had a meaning. Each held a story. Each was tied to your safety. Some women tied amulets around their necks. Others pinned them to their inner garments. The brave ones tucked them under their loincloths, closer to the source of life and danger. The amulet of Taret was the most popular, a squat, round-bellied figure, part hippo, part woman, with the back of a crocodile. She stood upright, wielding a knife, sometimes clutching a protection wand. Her eyes bulged, not in fear, but in eternal vigilance. Then there was Base, a protector of women and children. Base was grotesque in appearance, short, bearded, pot-bellied, with wild hair and a wide grin. Ateus's ness was part of his power. He frightened off demons and malignant spirits who might otherwise sneak into the birth canal. Base was often painted on walls or carved into bed frames, sometimes on the headrests where a woman slept. Some even believed that his face should be the last thing you saw before sleep, to guard your dreams and your unborn child from nightmares or worse. These weren't just decorations, okay? They were safeguards, because in Egypt, evil wasn't an abstract concept. It was breath, wind, a shadow that could enter a womb and rot it from within. The whispered prayers and spells. Pregnancy was not a medical condition in the modern sense. It was a ritual state, a transformation, a liminal phase between woman and mother, life and death, flesh and spirit. And so women, midwives, and priestesses often whispered spells not in fear, but in rhythm. One spell recorded in the Kahun papyrus reads, "I drive away the one who comes in darkness. I spit on the demon. I trample the bad wind. Let the breath of Hathor fill this house. Let this child be like Horus, untouched by poison." Spells were sometimes spoken over water, which the woman would then drink, or over oil, which would be rubbed into the skin, or even over bread, which would be broken and eaten by the mother-to-be. They didn't ask for luxury. They asked for survival, for the baby to be born with a heartbeat, for the bleeding to stop in time, for the mother not to be taken into the next world before seeing her child's face. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't. The quiet, monitoring midwives in ancient Egypt had no written certifications, no standardized procedures. Their expertise came from lived experience, hundreds of births, watched and attended over years of apprenticeship, and they monitored you without stethoscopes, without ultrasounds, without fetal heart monitors. They listened with their hands. They felt for movement around the 5th month, pressed their ear to your belly, measured the curve of your back, noted the swell of your ankles, paid attention to your dreams, because in dreams, it was said, the gods sometimes whispered warnings. A dream of water could mean safe passage. A dream of scorpions might mean a breech birth. A dream of a closed door could mean the womb was sealed, or the placenta misplaced. These were not diagnoses, but they were considered data, and they shaped the advice you received. Walk more, drink fennel water, sleep on your left side, bathe before sunrise. Don't argue with your mother-in-law until the baby is out. Some of it was old wisdom. Some was ritual habit, but all of it was given in seriousness, because midwives in ancient Egypt did not just bring babies into the world. They held the line between life and the underworld, and they were not always successful. Approaching the month of waiting as the final weeks of pregnancy arrived, movement became harder. Work became painful. But unless you were elite, there were no maternity leaves, no confinement rooms, no pampering. You continued, fetching water, sweeping floors, cooking over fire pits. Some women made arrangements to give birth in special birthing huts, temporary restructures built to mimic the protective embrace of Toriet's womb. But not all had access. Most women gave birth at home on mats, with midwives and family women gathered round. And every woman, as her belly dropped and the baby began to shift downward, thought the same unspoken thought. Would this be the last night she slept? Would she wake with life in her body, or would she pass into the dark, her name added to the list of mothers who did not return? No one said it out loud, but everyone knew. Pregnancy was not the beginning of a story. It was the middle of a risk. And risk in ancient Egypt was something even the gods could not always protect you from. The waiting never ends all at once. For days, there may be signs that the body is changing. Pains that mimic the pangs of false labor. Tightness across the lower back. An ache behind the pelvis that makes walking feel like dragging stone. But then, one night quiet, like a shadow spilling across a mud wall, it truly begins. It could start with a feeling, a rush of something behind the navel, a wave in the spine, a slow release of water in the bed mat beneath you, or a sharp pain, so sudden that it steals the breath, forcing your hands to grip your thighs. And then the room shifts. It doesn't matter how dark it is outside or whether the chickens are still sleeping in the yard. The world shrinks to one thing, the contractions. The body that once carried water jars and ground barley with steady rhythm now pulses with a new rhythm, one that cannot be stopped or postponed. In ancient Egypt, when this happened, the message spread quickly. Someone would run through the courtyard. Someone else would rouse the midwife. Another would bring the birthing amulets Bess, Toret, Kathor, prop them up along the walls, or tuck them beneath the bed mat. Doors would be closed. Neighbors would whisper. Children would be sent to gather water or fan the fire. And the woman, at the center of it all, would begin the ancient ritual of bringing life through pain. The birthing rituals, structured chaosing like modern delivery rooms. An ancient Egyptian birth was not clinical. It was sensory. There was incense in the air, sometimes myrrh, sometimes frankincense, sometimes dried acacia pods burning in small clay dishes. The smoke wasn't for atmosphere. It was to keep away spirits. Evil, in Egyptian cosmology, liked corners, shadows, and blood. And birth had all three. The floor was covered with woven mats, not just for comfort, but for grip. Tell us often, a birthing stool, 2 blocks with a gap in the center, made of wood or reeds, though many women squatted, supported under the arms by older women or midwives. Squatting was more than tradition. It used gravity to bring the child earthward. There were chants, low, repetitive phrases whispered or sung in rhythm with the contractions. Come forth, little one, child of earth, come to the light. Your mother opens the door. Your father waits in the hall. Let the gods smile on your breath, and let your cry be strong. Some of the chants came from temple texts. Others were invented on the spot, lullabies turned into mantras or prayers muttered out of exhaustion. The line between sacred and practical blurred in these moments, and if the labor dragged, if the child seemed to stall halfway through, the midwife would turn to her kit, the tools of an ancient midwife. There was no metal, no sterile gloves, no pain relief as we understand it, but there were tools. A birthing knife carved from flint or bronze, not to be used on the baby, but to cut the cord or remove after birth. Small bowls filled with oils, castor, linseed, or sesame used to anoint the lower belly, softened tissues or ease tearing, herbs wrapped in linen and soaked in beer or wine, sometimes used as compresses, a string or reed rope tied across the roof beams for the mother to grip during a squat birth, and, when desperation set in, pigeon droppings. It sounds absurd now, but in Egyptian medicine, dried and powdered pigeon feces were believed to stimulate uterine contractions. Some recipes involved mixing it with honey and applying it to the lower back or thighs. The logic, if you can call it that, was mystical. Earthy substances from living animals were thought to channel fertility energy. It was not modern science, but it was all they had, and the midwife had to make choices. Fast ones. When birth went wrong, sometimes the baby came quickly red-faced, squirming with a sharp cry, and a mother who bled only a little. But sometimes it didn't. There were no fetal monitors, no C-sections, no neonatal teams. The baby was breech. The midwife had only her hands and instinct. If the cord wrapped around the neck, there was no tool to see it. The mother hemorrhaged. There were no blood transfusions. Midwives did what they could. Some births were stalled for hours and two. The next day, the mother was given hot broth or barley beer to keep up strength. Cooling compresses were laid across the brow. In desperate moments, women were even inverted, hung by the legs or tilted back to shift the baby's position. But outcomes were often tragic. There are ancient letters etched in the shorthand of workers' villages that speak of women lost in childbirth, some buried with their unborn still inside them, some never named, only marked by grief. And yet, every generation tried again, because without children, families withered, lineages ended, labor was lost. So the cycle continued after the cry, after the blood. When the baby came out, if it came out alive, it was not greeted with sterile gloves and applause. It was wrapped in linen, its mouth cleared with a knuckle or a bit of cloth. If it didn't cry, it was rubbed with salt and dipped briefly in warm water. If it still didn't cry, the women would whisper the name of Hathor. Sometimes it worked. Then came the afterbirth, and with it, another wave of pain. Some midwives buried the placenta near the household shrine. Others dried it into powder to be used in future fertility rites. There was no single rule, only layers of belief. And what of the mother? She lived. She was fed flat bread, stewed onions, watered beer. She was washed, tucked into her bed, and given time to sleep. If she didn't, the baby was handed off to another woman, perhaps a sister, perhaps a neighbor, and a tiny clay figure of Taurid was placed beside her shrouded body. Naming and forgetting. Egyptians didn't always name a child at birth, especially not if the child was weak or born in the lean season. Names came later, sometimes a week, sometimes longer after the child had proven its will to live, and even then, names were flexible. A child might be called one thing by its mother, another by its father, and a third in official records. 4 girls. Names might honor goddesses. Is it Isis, Merit, Beloved, Nefret, Beautiful? The boys. Names might reflect hope or lineage. Hori. Horus is my protector. Minna, the enduring one. Ramos, son of Ra. But if the child died within days, it was often not buried with a name. Some villages kept lists of unnamed children. Others didn't write them at all. The silence was not cruelty. It was protection. To name a child that died too soon was to summon grief into the home. Better to light incense, make a gesture, and let the soul drift without anchor. The long days afterward, if the baby lived. The mother's body was not spared. Breasts swollen, nipples cracked, fever possible. No antibiotics if the milk ducts became infected. No help from husbands, who were often working in fields, building tombs, or serving in temple complexes. The mother was expected to return to chores quickly. There were no postpartum care systems, no maternal health weeks. You bled, then you moved. Some families assigned older daughters to help. Others relied on neighbors, and in a few elite households, a wet nurse was hired, a woman already producing milk, paid in grain or linen, to feed another's child. But for the average Egyptian woman, there was no such option. She fed the baby herself, even if her own diet was poor. Even if the milk was thin, and if she couldn't produce enough, she tried gruel, crushed dates with water, mashed bread with goat's milk. They had it. Many babies didn't survive that first year, and still every woman knew she might be pregnant again before long. Reflection that never left. The stories of ancient Egyptian pregnancy are not about royalty, not the golden beds of queens, nor the painted birth scenes on tomb walls. They are about the unnamed, the hundreds of thousands of women who bled into linen sheets, whispered spells into darkness, clutched amulets of hippos and dwarves, and hoped for one thing, that the baby would live, that she would live, that her name would be remembered. And, though the gods offered many protections, they never gave guarantees. So we ask ourselves, how many women walked that narrow path? How many of their names are lost in the sand? And how many of their daughters walked the same path again and again till the Nile wore down their bones? In ancient Egypt, to be a woman was to be watched, not by society in the way you might assume. No, the watching that mattered most came from the divine, the endless gaze of gods and goddesses who seemed to hover in every room, on every wall, and across every season of a woman's life. And for pregnant women, that gaze could feel both comforting and suffocating. It was not always clear whether the gods were guarding you or testing you. When the belly swelled and the back ached, you weren't alone. You were never alone. You were accompanied by Tauret, the hippopotamus goddess, with the sagging breasts and swollen belly, her crocodile tail curling behind her like a warning. You were flanked by Bes, the dwarf, with lion's mane and tongue sticking out, meant to scare demons away. And above you, in inscriptions and in thought, hovered Isis, the mother of mothers, with wings spread wide and a throne on her head. They were there in paint, in amulet, in chant, and in thought. And yet, when the bleeding started too early, or the breath left the baby's chest before a first cry, there was no one to appeal to, no remedy except belief, no recourse except ritual. So many women wondered quietly, if they are watching, why do they allow it? This was the divine burden of pregnancy in ancient Egypt, not simply physical strain, but the emotional weight of living in a world where the gods noticed everything, but didn't always intervene. The watchers on the walls, nearly every household, from simple adobe homes to more elaborate townhouses near Thebes, there were figures painted or carved onto walls. Many were benign images of animals, lotuses, stylized family scenes, but some were specific guardians. Tauret was common. She looked grotesque to modern eyes. a pregnant hippopotamus standing upright with pendulous human breasts and paws like a lioness. Yet she was loved. No goddess had a stronger association with childbirth. She guarded the threshold of labor. Her image was etched into amulets, bed legs, and even birthing stools. Base was less maternal and more comical. A squat-lined dwarf, often with bulging eyes and a protruding tongue. He was the fierce protector of households. He warded off spirits. He brought laughter. He made noise. And he danced. Yes, danced according to some papyri. Women played music during labor to call bass into the room, as if noise itself could drive danger away. And then there was Hathor, the Kyred goddess, who governed fertility, music, and motherhood. Her presence was more abstract, often symbolized through mirrors, sistrum's rattles, or the color gold. She was there not just to protect, but to witness. It was said that these deities stood at the invisible door between worlds, the line between life and death, childhood and motherhood, spirit and flesh. When a woman was pregnant, she passed near that threshold daily. And so she was watched, not because she was special, but because she was vulnerable. Offerings for safety. In the silence of the shrine sieve, you were lucky enough to live near a temple, or had family who could visit one on your behalf. You might send offerings, a clay figurine, a loop of beads, a handful of dates, maybe a folded scrap of linen with a name written in ochre ink, tied to a reed stalk and tossed into the temple basin. These were not bribes. Not exactly. They were gestures, ways of reminding the gods that you were here, that you needed something, that you were willing to believe. Women in labor sent messages to the divine long before they sent midwives running at the temple of Hathor. In Dendera, walls were inscribed with birthing scenes, goddesses assisting in labor, laying hands upon women's bellies, whispering magic. But the real women who visited didn't get those scenes. They got quiet priests, maybe incense, maybe a nod of reassurance. But the gods never whispered back. One scribe's note from the New Kingdom mentions a woman who sent a carved lion amulet to the temple with a plea to still the blood and keep the child inside. We don't know her name, don't know if it worked. That's the pattern. We know more about the prayers than their answers. Ritual and blamed still when something went wrong. It was rarely seen as fate. It was blame. Sometimes the woman was blamed for angering a goddess. Perhaps she had failed to fast on a sacred day. Perhaps she had spoken harshly to her mother. Perhaps she had stepped on a sacred beetle, unknowingly crushing a sign from the gods. These were not superstitions in the French sense. They were woven into the fabric of daily life. In some cases, the fault was passed to ancestral spirits. A great-grandmother displeased, a dead aunt who hadn't been properly mourned, a missing grave offering. Rituals existed to correct these perceived slights. You might be told to bathe in water that had been blessed by a priest and boiled with figs. Then sleep with an amulet under your neck. You might be instructed to recite a purification verse 12 times while holding your breath. You might be forbidden to eat garlic or leeks or to touch copper for 3 days. And if none of that worked, the bleeding didn't stop, or the child was born still, then the community simply turned away. Not with cruelty, with silence. Everyone believed the gods had their reasons. The isolation of expectations for many Egyptian women. The rituals were both a comfort and a cage. They couldn't drink cold water during certain moons, couldn't bathe in the Nile when the water turned red, couldn't eat fish on days associated with Isis mourning Osiris, couldn't raise their arms overhead after the 7th month, couldn't touch onions in the last trimester. These prohibitions were not enforced by law, but by belief and peer pressure. One wrong move, and someone might whisper that you were inviting demons, that your child would be punished, that the gods were watching. So many women endured pregnancy with a kind of quiet obedience, not just to the body, but to the pantheon above them. They whispered daily invocations. They lit candles. They tied knots in string and untied them slowly. Each morning, believing each unknotted thread brought them closer to safe delivery. Some scratched tally marks, cane to bricks to count down the weeks. Others kept secret charms wrapped in old linen, tucked under their garments. The gods, it was said, liked persistence, the presence of men. Or, like their rough fathers, were not absent in ancient Egypt, but they were distant. They rarely took part in pregnancy rites. Their role was often reduced to providing grain, fetching charms, or requesting blessings at a temple. In labor itself, they were almost never present. The birthing room was a female space, but men still believed. Some fathers hired ritual specialists to read the child's future through the mother's stomach. Others asked temple scribes to record the woman's dreams, particularly if she dreamed of animals, numbers, or colors. These dreams were believed to be messages from the gods, encoded warnings or promises. But when those messages turned dark visions of serpents, dead water, or silent birdsmen panicked because they, too, believed the gods were watching. And no one could argue with a god. The growing fear of twins, spirits, and monsters as the months wore on. The signs grew stranger. Some women swelled more than others. The belly expanded faster, the movement stronger. Twins, perhaps, or a warning. There are papyri that suggest twins were sometimes fair thought to indicate a spiritual disturbance or the presence of an angry ghost trying to be reborn. Women carrying unusually large or oddly shaped bellies were told to pray, more, to wear mirrors around the neck, to avoid looking at reflective water. Some believed that malformed children babies born with visible defects were signs of a god's displeasure or the intrusion of a demon. Such births were met with horror, secrecy, and in some cases, quiet abandonment, and yet others saw the same children as sacred, touched by the divine. There was no consensus, only fear. The open question by the 8th or 9th month. A woman in ancient Egypt had passed through dozens of small rituals, quiet superstitions, and private moments of doubt. She had knelt at shrines. She had burned herbs. She had counted pulses and dreams and tried to decipher the will of gods who had never spoken to her directly. And as the final days approached, she returned to one question again and again, sometimes whispered aloud, sometimes kept buried in thought. If the gods are watching, why do they so often look away? In the final days of pregnancy in ancient Egypt, time did not pass like it used to. The sun still rose and fell. The Nile still moved with its quiet persistence, and the scent of warm breads still drifted through village courtyards. Before a woman, nearing the end of her term, each day was no longer measured by the sun's arc, but by the silence of the womb, or the unexpected flutter of movement. And during those long hours of waiting, many women clung harder to the divine than they ever had before, not in the loud, ceremonial way of temple worship, but in the quiet rituals passed from grandmother to daughter, midwife to neighbor, woman to woman, because childbirth was not just a private affair. It was an act of survival, wrapped tightly in belief, and it took place not in the heart of a temple, but on the floor of a mud brick room, beneath the gaze of goddesses carved into wood or painted on pots. Goddesses who watched but didn't help birthing the ancient way in most Egyptian homes. There was no formal birthing room. Instead, a space would be cleared, often near the rear of the house, or in a shaded outdoor alcove if privacy could be arranged. Some families owned birthing bricks, rectangular clay blocks inscribed with protective symbols and sacred names. Of these bricks would be placed in a square around the woman as she labored. Their function wasn't structural, it was spiritual. They marked a sacred boundary, a space into which no evil spirit should enter. The woman would squat or kneel, often holding onto a rope or the shoulders of two attendants, usually relatives or neighbors with experience. Wealthier women might have a hired midwife or a servant skilled in the process, but for most, it was a community effort, quiet, urgent, and unseen. No medical instruments, no sterile gloves, cloths soaked in warm water, crushed herbs placed under the tongue, hands steady from repetition, not science. Incense might be burned, prayers muttered, songs sung. The sound of women's voices, encouraging, commanding, mourning, rejoicing, was the background noise of birth. And behind all of it was the sense that something greater was present in the room. Something invisible, watching. The invisible midwives sometimes. The women believed that the goddesses themselves came closer during labor. Tauret, of course, was summoned through amulets carved from faience, wood, or clay. Many women wore her image around their neck or waist. But when labor began, the amulet was often placed nearby, tied to the rope the woman gripped or laid atop the burning bricks. Base, though not a goddess, was always welcome. His grotesque features were meant to terrify demons who tried to steal a newborn's soul or disrupt a woman's body. Some midwives drew his face on pots or burnt his image into wood chips placed near the doorway. Isis was more distant, more royal. She wasn't always asked directly for help, but her presence lingered in the background. As the divine mother of Horus, who had given birth in secret after Osiris's death. Her story was whispered by women who felt alone, but the goddesses, even when invited, did not always answer. There were times when the labor stopped suddenly, when the baby's head would not turn, when the mother screamed and went quiet too soon, and in those moments, the watchers carved and painted did not blink. Birth and blame when a baby was stillborn, or when the mother bled too much and never rose from the mat. People looked not to bad luck or biology, but to broken rituals. Someone must have failed. Perhaps the offering had not been placed in the right shrine. Perhaps the household gods had been insulted, left without incense there, figurines covered in dust. Maybe the mother had eaten something forbidden, or maybe someone in the room had invited bad spirits in through careless words or unclean clothing. Sometimes a priest was summoned afterward, not to heal, but to explain. There are surviving text fragments of magical, religious papyri, detailed diagnoses for pregnancy loss. They speak of evil winds, of ancestral spirits seeking revenge, of gods withdrawing their favor, and in some cases, they spoke of the woman herself as the cause. If her body was too dry, it was said, the baby could not grow. Her womb was too cold. It could not hold life. If she had spoken ill of her husband or harbored jealousy toward another woman's child, the gods may have judged her unworthy. The divine watchers became divine juries, and the sentence had already been carried out. A name for the dead if the bad child was born dead or died shortly after birth. Naming was optional. This is one of the most painful silences in ancient Egyptian history. The absence of names for infants who did not live. While we have names of pharaohs, priests, and artisans carved into stone, we have almost no names for the many children who didn't survive. Some families gave them names quietly, perhaps never recorded. Some bury them with household items, necklaces, shells, bits of cloth. Others left the body on the edge of the desert, trusting the gods to do what they hadn't done before. Stillbirth was not necessarily shameful, but it was not celebrated. It was not commemorated on tomb walls or stele. It was passed over. The goddess Meskenet, who presided over childbirth and was said to shape each child's fate, was not blamed. She was rarely mentioned. Her silence mirrored that of the household, quiet, uneasy, full of unspoken questions. When it went right, not every birth ended in sorrow. When the gods did smile, when the labor went smoothly and the child cried, a different kind of silence followed, exhausted relief. Then ritual. The placenta was usually buried outside the home. In some traditions, it was believed to be connected to the child's soul and needed to be hidden from evil forces. The newborn was bathed in warm water infused with herbs, perhaps sweet flag or fenugreek, then swaddled in linen strips and placed on a soft reed mat near the mother's breast. A protective charm, often the Eye of Horus, might be tied near the baby's head. Some families sang quiet hymns or recited lines from a known spell, praising the gods for allowing the breath of life to remain. But even then, the watchers were not thanked too loudly. To do so might tempt fate. The gods had rules, it was said in some texts that the gods had rules. They could only interfere if they were invited properly. They could only protect if their name was spoken exactly, their symbol placed precisely, their expectations met completely. This belief both empowered and exhausted the women who relied on them, because even when everything was done correctly, tragedy still came. And when it did, women asked the same quiet question. Had I not prayed hard enough? Its emotional burden, the guilt for a silent womb, the anxiety during labor, the dread after birth was just as real as the physical pain, and it was made heavier by the belief that the gods were near, watching, judging, measuring, but never explaining. A culture of endurance. Despite all this, women carried on. They bore children in mud huts, in merchant houses, in temples, and across desert paths. They carried life inside them, knowing it might not emerge whole. They leaned on each other, on ritual, on gods who only sometimes answered. They endured not because they were brave, but because they had no alternative. Pregnancy was expected. Childbirth was a cycle, and gods, like seasons, were not to be questioned, only survived. In the absence of modern medicine, these women turned to whatever they had: clay charms, whispered spells, warm hands, and the watchful eyes of beings who offered no guarantees. And so they labored beneath the gaze of heaven, hopeful, fearful, and alone in ways no hymn could truly ease. Imagine waking each morning with a swelling belly beneath linen folds and the scent of crushed barley on your breath. You were pregnant in ancient Egypt, and the gods are everywhere. They are in the murals on temple walls, watching you with sideways eyes. They are in the household amulets hung beside the grinding stone. They are painted in red ochre on clay pots, etched into the wood of your chair legs. The gods have rules, expectations, and those rules surround your womb like salt around a sore dot. To be pregnant in ancient Egypt was to be constantly signed, but rarely helped. It wasn't that the people lacked faith. Quite the opposite. It was precisely because they believed so deeply in the gods that childbirth was so fraught with pressure, responsibility, and fear. To deliver a child was not just to survive a physical trial, it was to prove oneself worthy of divine favor and failure. That could be interpreted as punishment. 1,000 little rituals for a pregnant woman. Life became a quiet choreography of small movements and whispered incantations. There were things you could eat, and things you must never touch. Not because of nutrition, because of magic. You were told not to eat dates in the wrong phase of the moon, or to sleep with your head facing the west, where the dead lived. You avoided stepping over threshold stones too quickly. If you rinsed your hands in natron water each morning, if you dreamed of blood, or of serpents, or of black water, you did not speak of it aloud. When neighbors saw you, they greeted you with hopeful smiles, but they did not touch your belly. That was sacred, unstable, full of possibility and danger. Even a gaze held too long could be risky. There were tales of women cursed by the jealousy of other women, or struck down by the wandering spirits of those who had died in childbirth and grown bitter in the afterlife. So, you walked carefully, okay? You moved as if the air itself might hold. A trap. Postpartum in a spiritual world if. The delivery went well if. The baby was born living and the mother breathing. There was no great celebration. Not yet. The next days were the most dangerous of all. It was believed that the time immediately after birth was one of spiritual vulnerability. The mother's body was considered open, still exposed to spiritual forces. The baby, having just entered the world, had no protection of its own, so the house was sealed. This didn't mean doors locked or walls rebuilt. It meant symbolic protection, an eye of Horus drawn above the lintel, an amulet hung beside the sleeping mat, sacred, words inscribed in charcoal near the threshold. If the family had access to a priest, they might request a written charm. Otherwise, a midwife or neighbor would recite protective verses handed down through generations. The room itself became a kind of temple, temporarily. For 7 days, the mother and child remained there. Visitors were few. The outside world was kept away. Some families placed bowls of milk or honey by the doorknob as food, but as a ward. Sweetness repelled spirits. Bitterness invited them. The baby's name, if it was chosen early, was often not spoken aloud until this period ended. Some believed that spirits could use a name to track the soul. Others simply waited, as if to see whether the child would stay. Gender, and the god's divine support in childbirth, was deeply gendered. Female deities were expected to care. Male gods rarely entered the conversation. This wasn't mere social division, it was spiritual logic. The ancient Egyptians viewed childbirth as chaotic, wet, and unpredictable. It was the domain of women, and by extension, of female gods. But divine femininity in Egypt was not always nurturing. It could be fierce, conditional, and cold. Tauret, the hippo-headed protector, snarled as she defended. She was not a gentleman. Figure she was monstrous for your sake. She guarded the womb like a crocodile might guard its eggs. Mescanet, goddess who shaped each baby's fate at the moment of its first breath, did not intervene in labor. Her concern was destiny, not survival. And Isis, revered though she was, remained distant from ordinary women. Her motherhood was mythical, not domestic. Her pain served a cosmic purpose. Yours just hurt in this structure. Women found themselves caught between prayer and pressure. They could not command the gods only plead with them, and sometimes pleading wasn't enough. The healer's limited complications arose, bleeding that wouldn't stop, fever that burned from within, a child born too early to breathe. There was little to do. Egyptian medicine was advanced for its time. It included surgical instruments, sutures, and even prescriptions written in hieroglyphs. But childbirth was still largely left to midwives, not physicians, and most medical papyri focus on male ailments or generic injuries. Pregnancy, labor, and postpartum suffering were treated with superstition and soft herbs more than hard science. There were spells to hasten delivery or calm a troubled womb. Some involved ingesting mashed dates with beer. Others required speaking sacred words over a figurine of a frog, then burning the figure in a fire in a few cases. Women were massaged with oil warmed over coals while incantations were spoken. But if these failed, there was no escalation. Scalpel, no surgical solution, and often no burial stone either. Women who died in childbirth were sometimes not buried in family tombs. Their deaths were seen as polluted, dangerous, or a sign of something gone wrong spiritually. They might be placed on the outskirts of cemeteries. Their names might be whispered less frequently. Even in death, their labor continued through the echoes of caution passed to the next generation of women. A pregnant woman's afterlife intentions believed in an elaborate afterlife. But what about pregnant women who died before delivering, or newborns who died before they could be named? The two was unclear. Some texts suggested that the unborn joined the gods in a different kind of realm, neither field nor garden, but a place of preparation. Others were silent, completely, without proper burial rites or a known name. Many feared the soul would wander. Some said the spirits of unborn children lingered near the Nile's banks or haunted the edges of village homes. Women who had miscarried or buried a stillborn might leave small offerings at the water's edge, not for closure, but for peace. Sometimes a clay image was cast into the river, a symbolic child, a surrogate soul, a hope that whatever went wrong could be forgiven by someone unseen. It is impossible to know how many believed this or how many simply mourned in silence. The texts do not say. The gods did not answer. What remained in the end were fragments, amulets worn thin, linen strips stained from repeated use, a shallow dent in a birthing brick where dozens of hands had leaned, a midwife's chant, half remembered, a goddess's name scratched into a wall with a broken stick, a clay pot painted with crude lines, believed to resemble a protective face. History did not record their names, but it recorded their burdens and traces. In silence, in the overwhelming presence of gods who rarely intervened. And so, for the ordinary woman of ancient Egypt, pregnancy was not a celebration of life, but a negotiation with death. Every kick inside the belly was a question. Every cry from a neighbor's house, a warning. Every night, a prayer sobbed, scared and unsure. Will I survive this? Will the child live? Will the goddesses help? It's time. In ancient Egypt, time did not move according to clocks or calendars. It moved with the Nile. The river was not simply a feature of the landscape. It was a force of order and chaos, of nourishment and destruction, of life and interruption. For most of the year, it shimmered quietly under the sun, providing water for crops, transportation for goods, and a place to wash or cool your skin. But once each year, it rose with an almost supernatural rhythm. The inundation called Akhet by the Egyptians was not merely a season. It was a reshaping of life, and if your baby decided to come in the middle of it, you had no choice but to adapt. The waters that gave and took the flood was both predictable and disruptive, rising sometime between June and September. It brought with it fertile silt from upstream. This silt was the reason anything grew at all. Egypt was, in truth, a long river with deserts on both sides. The black soil near the Nile Kemet was the lifeblood of civilization. Without it, the red landish would swallow everything. So when the river rose, people accepted the chaos it brought as part of a larger balance. Homes on the edge of farmland were temporarily abandoned. Villages stocked up on preserved foods. Boats became doorsteps, and every man, woman, and child adjusted their routines. But pregnancy does not follow seasonal logic. A woman who entered her final month during the inundation faced a particular kind of trial, because during the flood, everything shifted. Midwives might be trapped across rising waters. Medical supplies, or what passed for them, might be floating in a clay pot tied to a raft, and the place where you were supposed to give birth, it might now be unreachable. The birth bricks in the mud for many Egyptian women. Birth occurred on simple tools called birth bricks, a pair of large, sun-dried clay blocks placed apart just enough for a woman to squat over. These bricks were typically stored in the homes of midwives or local healers, sometimes painted with protective symbols, frogs, hippos, or the goddess Toret. But birth bricks, like everything else, did not float. If your due date arrived mid-flood and your midwife's house was inaccessible or underwater, your options became both limited and primitive. You might be forced to squat over uneven stones, bricks scavenged from flood-damaged walls, or even woven mats hastily placed over high ground. These makeshift arrangements were dangerous. without the correct height or spacing. Squatting for hours during labor could cause severe leg cramps or collapse. Some women fell during labor. Some labored lying flat on the ground in the very mud that would become fertile fields weeks later. Birthing in mud. Literal, wet, bug-filled mud was not uncommon during agate. Women pushed through contractions, while insects circled above their heads, while frogs chirped in ditches, and while the nearby Nile groaned with currents and debris. The river gave its gifts, but it did not pause for childbirth. The missing midwife, competent midwife, was not a luxury in ancient Egypt. She was the thread that connected generations. She carried the words, herbs, hand positions, and chants, passed down orally for centuries. A woman giving birth without a midwife was like a priest left without his incantations, lone in the presence of something divine and dangerous. But the flood could isolate even nearby villages. A midwife who lived just across a field might now be separated by water too deep to walk through and too wide to cross. Boats were scarce. Most families had only one, if any, and that was needed for food, not ferrying. Some women waited, hoping the waters would recede, but labor waits for no tide, and so neighbors stepped in. Sometimes an older woman who had herself given birth a dozen times. Sometimes a cousin or aunt with trembling hands and no training. Sometimes no one in rare but not unheard of cases. A woman gave birth alone during flood season, in silence, without help. The screams were muffled by the rushing of water. Cries of newborns competed with the sounds of creaking reeds and distant thunder. And afterward, still had to clean the child, cut the cord, bind the belly. All while floodwaters licked at the edge of your doorway. The supplies that never arrived there were herbs the Egyptians believed helped during labor. Fennel to ease pain. Pomegranate bark boiled in water to slow bleeding. Honey mixed with garlic and natron to clean wounds. But all of these required preparation and access. During the inundation, trade slowed to a halt. Apothecary Sif, your village even had one might be unreachable. Clay jars of dried herbs could float away or become soaked. Honey might spoil. Garlic might mold. Even natron, the salt-like compound used for purification, might become clumpy and useless. The flood did not only bring water, it brought scarcity. Food stores were rationed more tightly. Fires for boiling water or sterilizing cloths were harder to maintain in damp, low-lying homes. Fuel was precious, and time stretched thin. A woman in labor during the flood was not always treated as an emergency, okay? The whole world felt like a slow-motion emergency, so you made do. You gave birth using cold rags. You drank whatever water was nearby, even if it tasted like earth and copper. You wiped blood with the same linen you used to swaddle the baby. The river did not stop, and neither could you. The walls that shifted many homes in rural Egypt were built of mud brick, cheap, effective, and vulnerable. The flood turned these homes into question marks. The walls that had kept you safe through the winter and spring, now darkened with water stains, crumbled at the base and softened like wet bread. In some cases, entire rooms collapsed inward, their ceilings too soggy to hold weight. Imagine giving birth while listening for the creak of the ceiling beam, while eyeing the corner wall that looked a little more bent than it did yesterday, while hoping the back room wouldn't become a puddle before nightfall. Some women gave birth in stables, or under woven red shelters built for storing grain, or on rooftops, flat, precarious platforms that baked under the sun and cracked under weight. There was no privacy, no safety, and often no choice. The baby that would not wait. Perhaps the most terrifying truth of all was this: babies did not know what season it was. They arrived early, late, or right on time, but not by your calendar, and not by the Niles. Some came during thunderstorms, some arrived during market days, when help was away, and some came during Akit, when water ruled everything and every resource was strained. A breech birth during flood season meant desperation. Twins meant double risk. A prolonged labor meant hunger, exposure, and the possibility of infection growing with every hour. And yet, the babies came, wrapped in wet linen, dried by fire smoke, swaddled in rags that had once been part of their father's tunic. They came screaming into the damp air, into the season of hunger and hope, and mothers somehow found the strength to welcome them, even when they had nothing to offer but their arms and the ground beneath them. An unasked question, the Nile kept rising. It did not lower itself for infants. It did not ease its path for women in pain. It simply did what it had done for millennia flood. Flow, recede, return. And as the waters lapped against homes and prayers were muttered under breath, one question remained. Why had the gods aligned the most fragile moment in a woman's life with the most turbulent moment in the land's? Was it a test or just coincidence, like so much else in nature? The floodwaters didn't just bring physical risk. They brought a strange silence, not the absence of sound, but a kind of social quietness, a lull in the usual rhythm of visits, gossip, errands, and shared tasks. During Akid, when water choked the fields and made the village into a network of little islands, life slowed, and for a pregnant woman, already physically slowed by the final weeks of gestation, it became even more isolating. She waited not just for the child, but for the waters to fall. But the Nile didn't keep a precise schedule. One year it came too high, another too low. The village could guess, but it could not know. And so they waited, together, apart. The days blurred into each other. The village of Promises, or Deir el Medina, or even some nameless patch of clay. Huts along the floodplain had a temple outside of the flood season. You would wake, collect water, tend the fire, sweep dust from the entryway. You might fetch a bundle of onions from a neighbor or trade old grain for dried fish. Its children ran between houses. Goats bleated. The smell of crushed lentils and burning dung filled the air, but not during AKHET. Now, waking meant stepping into humidity that never quite left the skin. Your clay roof dripped in the morning. Bread dough took longer to rise. Flies became bolder. And if you were expecting a child, it all felt more stretch. You couldn't wander far, couldn't squat for long without swelling or aching. Even speaking became effort. The air, thick with the Nile's breath, made every task heavier. The baby kicked, the fire smoked. The walls of your home sweated beside you. You counted days in the way only women in late pregnancy do, not by the sun up, but by pressure in the hips, tightness in the skin, a strange shifting in the belly that whispered, soon. But still, the river would not fall. The gods were watching, or so they set in, temples far removed from the muddy floodplain. Priests read signs into everything, the angle of a cloud, the number of fish seen at sunrise, the way incense burned at noon. They believed in order, in Ma'at, in childbirth, though chaotic and dangerous, was part of that order. Gods were said to protect the birthing woman toward the hippo-bodied guardian of childbirth, and Base, the dwarf god who danced and snarled to chase away evil spirits. Images of them were carved into birth bricks, painted onto walls, worn as amulets. But during the flood, even gods felt farther away. The temple might be unreachable. The priests might be wading through waist-deep water to tend to higher ground. Rituals were postponed, festivals canceled, and a woman deep in labor might have only the faint outline of Tauret carved on a broken potsherd nearby. Still, she muttered the prayers. Still, she tied red cords around her ankles and wrists, believing they would keep the demons at bay. Still, someone would sing the MHN chant rhythmic and quiet, passed down through the women in the village, because what else could they do? The old remedies in a new, seasoned Egyptian medicine was not crude. It was, in many ways, experimental, empirical, and deeply observant. Physicians recorded symptoms and treatments on papyri, some of which survive today, like the Ebers and Cahoon papyri listing. Everything from labor-inducing mixtures to ways to ease afterbirth pain. But none of those texts accounted for what happened when the ingredients weren't available. Dried crocodile dung, useless if it floated downstream. Pomegranate rind, moldy from storage. Dates for energy, gone, eaten weeks ago. So the village adapted. One midwife might roast barley on a flat stone, mixing the ashes with water to make a bitter tonic. Another might steep wormwood leaves in oil to massage a laboring woman's belly. If nothing else, they would burn dried palm fronds nut for medicinal purpose. But for warmth, for light, for the illusion of control, there was no certainty, only habit, only old women's hands, only stories passed down. Your great-aunt drank this when the waters rose and the child came backwards. This worked for the neighbor with the twins. And always, always, may Tourette be with you. Birthing and about in some regions, when the waters rose too high, homes were simply abandoned for the season. People moved to higher ground. But what of the woman who had already begun labor when her home was swallowed? Some gave birth in boats. These were not elaborate vessels. They were reed bundles lashed with palm fiber, small wooden rafts meant for fishing, now pressed into new duty. A flat-bottomed boat would be lined with mats. 2 or 3 women would sit around the laboring mother, trying not to shift their weight too much, lest the entire thing tip sideways. Water lapped against the sides. Frogs chirped nearby. Insects clung to every surface. If the woman screamed, her voice disappeared into the sky. The baby arrived between shifts of the paddle, between watching for crocodiles, between waves. Some mothers named their children after the season Akhet, a flood child, or Hapi, after the god of the Nile. Not because it was auspicious, but because the season marked them. They had survived it, entered life through water, through chaos when labor was interrupted. Sometimes the problem wasn't the river, it was the people. Floods brought more than water. They brought pests, both human and animal. Grain stores ran low, fights broke out, thieves prowled. And even in small villages, tension rose with the tide. A pregnant woman might be in the middle of labor when a knock came at the door. A man needed her husband's help. A boat had broken loose. A goat had drowned. The food store was rotting. And so labor paused mentally, not physically. She waited while her husband tied ropes around a drifting log. She waited while someone shouted across water for aid. She waited while midwives argued over who had access to which herbs or blankets. Labor did not stop, but help became distracted, and for a woman half naked and doubled over in pain, there was no pause button for the contraction now tearing through her body. The weight of the afterbirth giving birth did not mean safety. The danger was not over once the baby emerged. The afterbirth, the placenta, had to be delivered. Bleeding had to stop. The child had to be cleaned, warmed, fed. The cord had to be tied with linen, or string, preferably something red, protective, symbolic. But during flood season, even these tasks became complicated. There was no dry cloth. Firewood was wet. Ashes turned to sludge. The umbilical knife's sharpened flint or bronze might have rusted or been swept away. The rush basket meant to cradle the baby might have warped in storage. Some mothers bled too much. Some babies never cried. Some mothers stared blankly ahead, hollow-eyed from exhaustion and dehydration, unsure whether to mourn or feel relief. And still the water crept along the edges of the room. The floating days after his mother and baby survived the birth. They faced the next ordeal, surviving each other. Milk might not come, or it might sour in the mother's body from stress and poor nutrition. The baby might cough, might not suckle, might not stop crying. There were no doctors, only old women and guesses. If the baby lived, neighbors would come, waiting, boating, shouting over the water to bring offerings, dried herbs, bread, soaked in beer, a new amulet, perhaps even a woven tunic, gifted in silence. The new mother sat in her corner of the room, watching the Nile from her threshold. She did not leave. She bled slowly, recovered slowly, drifted through the days like driftwood, caught between currents. The child slept against her chest, wrapped in damp linen. Outside, the frogs sang louder. The river had not yet receded. A thought that lingered: some women did not name their children until the flood ended. It was not just a custom, it was a hesitation. To name something too early was to tempt fate, to place a permanent word on something temporary. So they waited for the river to fall, for the baby to survive, for the world to feel stable again. And in that waiting, a quiet question repeated in their minds: would the land remember their labor? Would the river? Or would it all be washed away again next year? By the time the Nile began to fall, everything was coated in a film of memory. The waterline left behind not just silt, but silence. A slow quietude in the house, a murky imprint on every wall, every step. For the woman who had given birth during flood season, that silence meant survival, but not relief, because now came the part no one wanted to talk about. The slow return, the tasks that waited, the expectations that piled on top of a body still healing. The waters receded, but the weight did not dot the village emerges. The sun shone differently once the waters pulled back, crisper, higher, hotter, and the land underneath the Nile, black with fertile promise, cracked underfoot. Crops had to be planted immediately, no time to delay. If the grains weren't in the soil soon, the entire next year's harvest would suffer. For men, this meant hard labor. For women, it meant feeding those men, nursing babies, repairing mats, hauling water again. And for a woman who had just survived childbirth, it meant doing all that while still bleeding. There was no postpartum rest in ancient Egypt, not unless you were from a noble household with attendants and wet nurses. In the village's real Egypt, the Egypt that never made it into golden tombs, there were only expectations, quiet ones, implied ones. No one said, "You must do this now." But everyone looked, and so she rose, days or a week after giving birth. She walked to the edge of the fields with clay jugs to refill. Her back ached, her breasts stung. Her feet, softened by weeks of wet ground, blistered in the re-emerging sun-baked dirt. The baby was wrapped on her back with linen faded from floodwater, still too small to be named, still watched for signs of life with every breath. But life didn't wait. Forgotten practices and unseen risks. In modern terms, we would call what came next maternal depletion, nutritional collapse, iron loss, risk of infection, postnatal depression. But none of those terms existed in 1300 BCE. What existed was, she seems tired, or worse, she doesn't talk anymore. Midwives had no pills, no stitching thread, no antiseptic. They had warm oil, amulets, and sometimes beer. It was often enough, but not always. If the mother developed a fever, she might sweat it out, or she might not. If she bled too long, they might try a poultice of crushed acacia and clay packed between her thighs. If she wept constantly, they might blame evil spirits or a displeased ancestor, offering incense to base or burning dried mint under her bed. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but no one called it postpartum depression. No one blamed the river. A child's first days, babies born during Ket, had their own superstitions. Some believed they were marked by the Nile's temperament, sensitive, moody, prone to wandering. Others believed they were sacred, protected by the flooding season's association with rebirth and the gods. But whatever the belief, the practice was the same. The baby must survive 30 days. That was the threshold, a kind of invisible test. If the baby passed, it would be named, fed from a carved bowl, kissed on the crown by the village elder. If the baby died, no name, no ceremony. The child became one with the season, a lost ripple in the Nile's long memory. This wasn't cruelty. It was coping, the harsh mathematics of a world without medicine. So mothers waited, watched, whispered prayers to Hathor and Toret, rubbed oil on the baby's head, measured every cry, every feed, every silence, and held their own breath. Normal returns, slowly, eventually. The village returned to its old rhythm. Voices drifted between walls again. Children laughed in dusty lanes. Goats and donkeys kicked up mud, now hardened into flake-like scales on the earth. Bread ovens, long dormant, smoked again. The Nile, calm and low, glimmered in the distance, and for the woman who had birthed her child during the flood, there was still no ceremony, no reward, just continuation. She returned to chores. She taught older children. She ground barley. She mended sandals. Her belly was soft now, her arms stronger, her eyes older. She had changed, but the world had not. No monument would be built, no scroll inscribed, just a baby in the slow crawl of time. How stories were stored. Every flood brought its own set of births, and every mother had a story, but few were written down. Egyptian scribes recorded harvests, tax records, pharaohs, decrees, battles won, granaries filled. They wrote about gods and tombs and the sun's cycle. They recorded dreams and prophecies, but rarely childbirth, rarely the stories of ordinary women. Yet stories persisted. They were stored not in scrolls, but in glances, in the way one midwife tied a linen cord, in the way a mother taught her daughter to chant Bess's name, in the half-jokes shared at the grinding stone, born in the flood, stubborn as a crocodile. That's how history truly survived, not in stone, but in repetition. The Nile's memory, and so the river receded, as it always did. The next season would come, then the next. The woman who had given birth would do so again, or not. She might live to watch her child walk, or she might vanish before the next flood. That was the nature of the time. But the river remembered. Its banks held stories no one recorded. Stories that swept through papyrus reeds and across fish scales. Stories that touched every home and vanished before they could be written. And as the woman stood by the Nile, her baby now heavier in her arms, she watched the slow current pulling south, quiet, relentless, and maybe, just maybe, she wondered, would this river remember her name, or only her labor? In the soft stillness of the morning, long before the rising of the sun over the east bank of the Nile, a woman rose quietly from her mat. Her body, still tender from childbirth just weeks ago, creaked like a reed fence in the breeze. But there was no pause, no time to wait for her joints to loosen or her shoulders to realign after another night spent sleeping on her side to keep the newborn warm. Her own child whimpered beside her, still half swaddled in worn linen. But she didn't pick him up, not yet, because that morning, like every morning now, someone else's child came first, and so she adjusted her tunic, washed her hands in a clay basin still smelling faintly of river silt, and prepared herself to walk down to the house of her employer, to the baby she didn't birth, to the mouth that now fed. For her own sons, she was a wet nurse, and that meant her milk no longer belonged to her. The unspoken transaction in ancient Egypt, being a wet nurse, was considered both an honor and a quiet sacrifice. It was a role given weight by the gods, a divine responsibility. The milk of a woman was not seen as merely physical nourishment, but it was protection, strength, and spirit. The child who suckled from a healthy, well-fed woman was thought to inherit part of her essence, her inner force. But for all its spiritual weight, the transaction itself was simple, cold, sometimes cruel. You gave your milk. They gave you coin, or bread, or protection, but not always respect, especially if you were poor, especially if the child you fed was rich. Most wet nurses in ancient Egypt were drawn from the lower ranks of society. Some were slaves, some were freed servants, some were simply desperate mothers whose own households could not afford to raise another child. So they traded the one gift they had left. It was not uncommon for a woman to feed another's baby while her own sat, waiting, hungry, wrapped in silence. This wasn't dramatized. It was just routine, another structure in a world ruled by hierarchy, ritual, and necessity. Who got a wet nurse? It wasn't every baby. Wet nurses weren't for the village folk, the fishermen's wives, or the wives of field laborers. Those mothers, no matter how tired or malnourished, breastfed their own children, watched them grow weak without. Wet nurses were for the elite, for priests, for scribes, for nobility, for the women who had the means to offload the physical demands of motherhood onto another, and, importantly, for children whose mothers had died. Childbirth was dangerous, even in a land famed for its medical scrolls and herbal knowledge. A wealthy man might find himself with an infant and no wife. In such cases, a wet nurse wasn't just useful, she was essential. But she wasn't family. She was a servant with sacred duties and very little voice. And though sometimes she was given gifts, or referred to in later inscriptions as beloved nurse of the house, most of the time her name went unrecorded. You might know the child she fed, but you would not know her. Inside the nurseries of elite households in ancient Egypt were not like the pastel-painted cribs of modern times. There were small rooms lined with mats, baskets, and low stools, often attached to the women's quarters or tucked near the granary where it was warm, closed, and easy to guard. In these nurseries, the wet nurse sat for hours, cradling the infant, feeding him when he whimpered, humming softly when the air turned hot and still. Sometimes she was permitted help. A young girl to fetch water, a servant to fan away flies. But mostly, she was alone with the child and the slow rhythm of her duties, burping, feeding, rocking, feeding again, and all the while, her body gave what little it had left, because wet nurses weren't given special diets. They were expected to nourish themselves as best they could on whatever food the household provided. Dates, bread, lentils, if she was lucky. A bit of honey or boiled fish. She had to keep producing milk. Her job depended on it, and so she chewed slowly, prayed quietly, tried not to think about her own son waiting at home. The ritual of bonding, its boundaries. One of the strangest dynamics of ancient wet nursing was emotional. The baby came to recognize her scent, her voice, her heartbeat. Some cried when she wasn't near. Some curled against her side in sleep. Some reached up to touch her cheeks as she sang the lullabies of her own mother. Long dead, half remembered through the rhythms of the Nile. But she couldn't call them her child. She wasn't allowed. There were rules, some spoken, but firm. You could love the baby. You could protect him, feed him, teach him how to grasp and sit and recognize the world. But the child did not belong to you. Your job was to disappear when your usefulness ended. This created a fracture, a line, carved deep between body and heart. And it wasn't often talked about. Meanwhile, at home, the woman's own child, the one she carried, the one she labored to bring into the world, stayed with her sister or her mother-in-law, or another woman in the neighborhood. He drank second milk, the thin drops left at the end of a long day. He cried longer, slept fitfully. Sometimes he grew strong anyway. Sometimes not. Some wet nurses dried up too quickly. Their milk went sour. Their health faltered. They were dismissed without ceremony. Others were kept for years, hired again when the next child arrived, but no matter how long they stayed, the story was always the same. The child grew. The job ended. The woman left. The records, if they existed, named only the child's lineage, not the lips that had kept him alive. Quiet kind of power, but some wet nurses carved out quiet power. Those who served temples, nursing the children of high priests were sometimes given burial in the necropolis, a rare honor. Others were invited into the household long-term, becoming nursemaids, caretakers, even confidants to the child they once fed. A few, like the famed Satbatop, were memorialized in stone, though even then her name appeared only because of the nobleman's affection. Still, for most, the reward was survival, a steady wage, few more years of life, and a strange, unspoken knowledge that the future pharaoh, or scribe, or landowner once drew breath because of her. That history, unwritten, still passed through her hands. And so the wet nurse walked back home at dusk, her shoulders aching, her tunic stained. She reached for her own baby, who blinked at her with confusion, and she whispered, "Wait, no longer," because for a few hours till the morning came again her body was her own. But how many women were forgotten like this? How many left no inscription, no statue, no scroll? How many gave everything and remained unnamed? The Nile flowed the same way every year, with its flooding and retreat like the long breath of a sleeping god. But human lives did not move so predictably, especially the lives of women who lived not by name, but by function. To be a wet nurse in ancient Egypt was to be a body first, a person second, a vessel of nourishment, hired and dismissed like a pot or basketful, only when full. And yet, despite the invisibility of these women in the records of kings and scribes, their milk was a lifeline across classes, dynasties, and centuries. It was whispered in the papyri of physicians, sketched faintly in temple walls, and implied through quiet hierarchies that ruled the household from within. This was not just a job, it was a form of control, of survival, of servitude, and sometimes of status, though never truly power. The official contracts and the unspoken rules, though many wet nurses were informally employed. There is evidence of formal contracts used by elite families. These contracts, often recorded on astraka or fragile sheets of papyrus, laid out expectations. I, Panub, agreed to nurse the child of Lady Teddy for 18 months, receiving in return 1 sack of barley per month, 1 jug of beer every 10 days, and linen to wrap the child. Some contracts also contained clauses about exclusivity, requiring the wet nurse not to become pregnant during the term of service, which would interrupt milk production. Others required the nurse to live within the employer's household, cutting her off from her own family entirely. But the words in ink were not the whole agreement. There were customs that governed behavior more powerfully than law. She must not speak out of turn. She must not form too close a bond with the child. She must keep her opinions to herself, especially regarding parenting. In wealthier households, she might be forbidden from eating with the family or participating in temple festivals. Even in death, the wet nurse often remained a servant buried in a different section of the tomb complex, her name etched without honorifics, if at all. Milk as status symbol for elite women in ancient Egypt. The decision to use a wet nurse was sometimes more than practical. It was fashionable in the New Kingdom, particularly under the 18th and 19th dynasties. Wealthy noblewomen were expected to maintain their appearances and attend ceremonies soon after childbirth. Nursing an infant, herself sleepless, swollen, and exhausted, could interfere with that, so she passed the task down, and having a wet nurse was a signal A quiet announcement that the household was prosperous enough to outsource even the most intimate duties of motherhood. The nurse, meanwhile, knew her place. She sat behind curtains or screens while feeding the child. She handed the baby over the moment the mother was ready to be seen in public with him. And, in many cases, she wasn't even allowed to watch the child grow up. Once her services were no longer needed, she was sent away, sometimes with payment, sometimes with nothing but fading memories and engorged silence. Ritual cleanliness and divine milk in temples dedicated to Hathor, the goddess of motherhood, joy, and fertility priests. And midwives offered jars of milk as sacred offerings. Milk was seen as a force that nourished both body and spirit, connecting humans to the gods. In some myths, the sun god Ra was said to be fed by the milk of celestial cows. The pharaoh himself was suckled by Isis in symbolic depictions, reinforcing his divine legitimacy. But the wet nurses who provided this milk in reality were not seen as divine. They were often subject to rigorous standards of purity. Some temples required them to undergo ritual cleansing before beginning a new contract. They were inspected for skin diseases. Their bodies were watched for signs of corruption, ulcers, scabs, or rashes that might spoil the milk. Even menstruation, though natural, was a source of anxiety for employers. This might mean a drop in supply, or worse, it might be seen as spiritually unclean. So the wet nurse, though vital, was held at arm's length, celebrated in theory, scrutinized in practice. What happened when the milk stopped? No one lasted forever. At some point, the milk ran dry. The child weaned. The job ended, and then the questions began. Would she be retained as a nanny? Dismissed without notice? Did she have savings? Had she earned enough to feed her own family again? Some women were luckier than others. If the child had grown attached, the family might allow the nurse to stay on in a different role. These long-term wet nurses sometimes became informal advisors or household caretakers, but more often they were let go with only the barest provisions. Their usefulness gone. Their presence unnecessary. In rare cases, wet nurses formed bonds strong enough to be remembered decades later. A tomb inscription from the site period reads, "To Tadi Heb, the beloved wet nurse of my childhood, who comforted me when I cried, and whose milk I drank as my first meal." But these tributes were rare. Most nurses vanished from the record like shadows at sundown. Wet nurses in the eyes of other women's. Relationship between a birth mother and a wet nurse was complicated. There may have been gratitude. There may have been envy. One woman who bore the child but did not feed it. Another who fed the child but could not claim it. This tension was seldom spoken aloud, but it simmered in gestures, the way the mother watched the nurse hold the child, or the way the nurse looked down when the mother entered the room. In some cases, noble women were warned not to let their children grow too attached to the wet nurse, fearing the emotional bond might confuse lineage or breed rebellion, so limits were enforced, not legally, socially, and that might be the cruelest part of all the way affection itself had boundaries. The emotional toll. Imagine, for a moment, the nurse walking home after her dismissal. She carried no baby in her arms, though her arms had learned the weight. Her tunic smelled faintly of sandalwood oil from the household where she had served. Her milk, still flowing for a few more days, leaked into cloth. She passed a group of women talking about the upcoming festival of Opet. She did not stop. She passed a shop where boys played a dice game beside the bread vendor. She did not look. She stepped into her own home, where her husband asked nothing and her own child did not recognize her immediately, and she lay down, not on a cushion of linen, but on a woven mat in a shared room that smelled of smoke and sweat. In memory, no paintings on the wall, no amulets to record her role, just silence and the ache of having given everything and taken nothing with her. How many women like this walked the streets of Thebes or Memphis or Abydos? How many nurtured futures that never knew their names? And why did a society that revered motherhood leave its milk bringers to disappear? In the cool hours of the morning, before the sun's full, I opened over the Nile. A woman once again prepared herself, not for ceremony, not for recognition, but for quiet continuity. It's the work that still had to be done. The wet nurse had finished her job. The child no longer fed at her breast. But that didn't mean the burdens ended. In ancient Egypt, where society's gears turned steadily under the weight of ritual, grain, and hierarchy, life simply continued, often without fanfare, and almost always without thanks. What became of the woman after the child was weaned? Let us follow her when the job ends and nothing replaces it. There were no retirement plans for wet nurses in ancient Egypt. Once a child reached the age of 2 or 3, breastfeeding was typically considered complete. From that point on, the nurse, unless reassigned, was released from her role. A fortunate few, especially those who had served in wealthier households, might be retained as general caregivers or house servants. But this depended entirely on the goodwill of the family, not the law. Some families were generous. They might provide ongoing work, or even find a match for the wet nurse's daughter if she had one. They might offer continued access to temple provisions or sponsor a place for her in a women's quarter attached to a household. Others, especially those lower in status, simply ended the arrangement. The payment ceased, the milk dried, the name forgotten, with little social standing and often few resources, many of these women returned to subsistence lives in laboring communities, drawing water, grinding grain, weaving linen, or preparing offerings for temple rituals. Their hands remained busy, but their identities had shifted. Once central to the growth of a new life, they were now just another pair of hands in the crowd, markers in the tombs. The few who were remembered, few wet nurses, were immortalized in stone, a rare honor. In particular, some tombs in the Theban necropolis include depictions of women identified as Menet, the word for wet nurse. These were usually associated with children of elite rank or royal birth, where the nurse's role had ceremonial overtones. One such example comes from the tomb of Seneferi, a high official of the 18th dynasty whose own wet nurse was depicted in a side chamber, kneeling in profile, a small child at her breast. Her name was Hinawet. The inscription beneath her reads, "She who nurtured me when I was helpless." It is one of the few known expressions of personal sentiment toward a nurse. It's captured for eternity in paint on limestone. But most wet nurses were not so lucky. Their contributions were silent. Their existence mentioned only indirectly, if at all, in temple scrolls, household inventories, or contracts that turned to dust in the hands of time. This absence is itself a kind of presence, a pattern of silence that says much about how labor, gender, and service were viewed in one of the world's oldest civilizations. Biological consequences and long-term strain. Wet nursing was not a temporary inconvenience. It altered a woman's body. Extended lactation, often demanded over a period of 2 or more years, could delay the return of a normal menstrual cycle. This sometimes affected fertility long-term, especially in women asked to nurse several children in succession. A wet nurse who became pregnant again during her contract could face dismissal. Yet avoiding pregnancy required abstinence, which for married women was not always possible or welcomed. Some scholars believe that repeated cycles of lactation, pregnancy, and labor, paired with poor nutrition and high physical demands, contributed to higher mortality rates among working-class women compared to their wealthier counterparts. The irony was sharp. Women who helped preserve the lives of Egypt's children sometimes lost their own, not through catastrophe, but through exhaustion, neglect, in a life measured more in offerings than in affection, community, grief, and the bonds that remained still. Not everything vanished with the end of the job. In some villages, particularly those in Upper Egypt, where community structures were tighter, former wet nurses retained informal bonds with the families they had once served. They might still be called mother of so, even if the child no longer visited. During festivals, especially those dedicated to Hathor, Isis, or Base, former wet nurses sometimes took part in rituals of fertility and protection. They offered milk, bread, or incense to the gods, not just for their own children, but for the many they had helped raise. These acts were not compensation, but they were gestures, acknowledgments of a role played, even if no longer formally honored. Some former wet nurses became midwives, passing on what they had learned to younger women. Others mentored new nurses, teaching how to swaddle, how to soothe colic, how to check the tongue or feel the pulse. In this way, a kind of quiet wisdom persisted, not through temples or tombs, but through hands and habits, the imaginary line between mother and servant, perhaps. The most painful aspect of the wet nurse's role was the intimacy it demanded and the detachment it required. She had to care for the child as though it were her own, but without forming an emotional claim. She had to offer comfort, stability, presence, and then vanish when no longer needed. In this, she mirrored many women throughout history who have given their bodies, their time, and their care, only to be dismissed when the child grew or the service concluded. The idea that motherhood could be rented or borrowed is not unique to ancient Egypt, but in this civilization, so rich with gods and ritual, the contradiction is particularly sharp. Egypt venerated Isis as the mother of Horus, lionized Hathor as the great nourisher, and built temples adorned with sacred nursing scenes. And yet, the real women who mirrored these divine acts were seldom praised. They were needed, they were used, and then they were gone. The modern Ikwifi. Listen closely. You can still hear the echoes of these women in today's world, in every underpaid caregiver, in every mother who feeds another's child while her own waits, home, in the postpartum nurse dismissed without a thank-you, in the domestic helper who knows the layout of another family's home better than her own. These roles are not new. They are ancient, worn like smooth stones by the passing of thousands of years. And when we look back at ancient Egypt, with its grandeur, its pyramids, its gods that lived on papyrus, we must also look at the corners of its houses, the shadows behind its curtains, the hands that cradled children who never learned their names. For they are history, not written in stone, but written in milk. Asterisk, good night, ...